The Tale of Greek Philosophers, Part 2.
Ancient Greek philosophy. The Hellenists, Epicurus, the Cynics, the Stoics, the Skeptics, developed schools or movements devoted to distinct philosophical lifestyles, each with reason at its foundation. Thales, often considered the first Western philosopher to the Stoics, Skeptics, ancient Greek philosophy, opened the doors to a particular way of thinking that provided the roots for the Western intellectual tradition. We find proto-scientific explanations of the natural world in the Milesian thinkers. We hear Democritus posit atoms, indivisible and invisible units, as the basic stuff of all matter. With Socrates comes a sustained inquiry into ethical matters, an orientation towards human living and the best life for human beings. With Plato comes one of the most creative and flexible ways of doing philosophy, which some have since attempted to imitate by writing philosophical dialogues covering topics still of interest today in ethics, political thought, metaphysics, and epistemology. Xenophanes directly challenged the traditional anthropomorphic depiction of the gods, and Socrates was put to death for allegedly inventing new gods and not believing in the gods mandated by the city of Athens. After the fall of Alexander the Great, and because of Aristotle's ties with Alexander and his court, Aristotle escaped the same fate as Socrates by fleeing Athens. Epicurus, like Xenophanes, claimed that the mass of people is impious since the people conceive of the gods as little more than superhumans, even though human characteristics cannot appropriately be ascribed to the gods. Xenophanes of Colophon, Xenophanes, c. 570 c. 478 BCE, directly and explicitly challenged Homeric and Hesiodic mythology. It is good, says Hesiod, to hold the gods in high esteem, rather than portraying them in raging battles which are worthless. More explicitly, Homer and Hesiod have attributed to the gods all things that are blameworthy and disgraceful for human beings: stealing, committing adultery, deceiving each other. At the root of this poor depiction of the gods is the human tendency towards anthropomorphizing the gods. But mortals think gods are begotten, and have the clothing, voice and body of mortals, despite the fact that God is unlike mortals in body and thought. Indeed, Xenophanes famously proclaims that if other animals, cattle, lions and so forth, were able to draw the gods, they would depict the gods with bodies like their own. Beyond this, all things come to be from earth, not the gods, although it is unclear whence came the earth. The reasoning seems to be that God transcends all of our efforts to make him like us. If everyone paints different pictures of divinity, and many people do, then it is unlikely that God fits into any of those frames. So, holding the gods in high esteem at least entails something negative. That is, that we take care not to portray them as superhumans. Who can judge what they know nothing of? Know thyself.
Pythagoras, the man, the myth, the math.
Ancient thought was left with such a strong presence and legacy of Pythagorean influence, and yet little is known with certainty about Pythagoras of Samos, c. 570 c. 490 BCE. Many know Pythagoras for his eponymous theorem: the square of the hypotenuse of a right triangle is equal to the sum of the squares of the adjacent sides. Whether Pythagoras himself invented the theorem, or whether he or someone else brought it back from Egypt, is unknown. He developed a following that continued long past his death, on down to Philolaus of Croton, c. 470 c. 399 BCE, a Pythagorean from whom we may gain some insight into Pythagoreanism. Whether or not the Pythagoreans followed a particular doctrine is up for debate, but it is clear that with Pythagoras and the Pythagoreans, a new way of thinking was born in ancient philosophy that had a significant impact on Platonic thought. The Pythagoreans believed in the transmigration of souls. The soul, for Pythagoras, finds its immortality by cycling through all living beings in a 3,000-year cycle until it returns to a human being. Indeed, Xenophanes tells the story of Pythagoras walking by a puppy who was being beaten. Pythagoras cried out that the beating should cease because he recognized the soul of a friend in the puppy's howl. What exactly the Pythagorean psychology entails for a Pythagorean lifestyle is unclear, but we pause to consider some of the typical characteristics reported of and by Pythagoreans. Plato and Aristotle tended to associate the holiness and wisdom of number, and along with this, harmony and music, with the Pythagoreans. Perhaps more basic than number, at least for Philolaus, are the concepts of the limited and unlimited. Nothing in the cosmos can be without limit, including knowledge. Imagine if nothing were limited but matter was just an enormous heap or morass. Next, suppose that you are somehow able to gain a perspective of this morass, To do so, there must be some limit that gives you that perspective. Presumably, nothing at all could be known, at least not with any degree of precision, the most careful observation notwithstanding. Additionally, all known things have number, which functions as a limit of things insofar as each thing is a unity or composed of a plurality of parts.
Heraclitus, The Philosophy of Fire.
Heraclitus believed that reality is made up of contraries, and that the constant process of change keeps it in balance. Fire holds great significance in his view of the cosmos, representing both need and satisfaction. It is the primary element from which all things originate and to which they return. Fire also serves as a metaphor for the tension and distension that is characteristic of life and reality. Heraclitus famously stated that a road up and down is one and the same. He believed that whether you travel up or down a road, it remains the same road. He also emphasized the idea of constant change by saying that you cannot step into the same river twice. This concept of perpetual change led one of his disciples, Cratylus, to communicate through gestures instead of words, fearing that words would freeze a reality that is always fluid. According to Heraclitus, the cosmos and everything within it exist through the tension and distension of time and becoming. Things are what they are because of what they are not. The ever-burning cosmos is in a constant state of conflict, and yet, it is also at peace. It constantly desires fuel to keep burning, and yet it burns and finds satisfaction. Heraclitus's philosophy emphasizes the dynamic nature of reality, and the importance of contraries in maintaining balance. His ideas continue to inspire and challenge our understanding of the world.
Parmenides and Zeno, the pioneers of metaphysics.
Parmenides was a pivotal figure in pre-Socratic thought, and one of the most influential of the pre-Socratics in determining the course of Western philosophy. According to McKirahan, Parmenides is the inventor of metaphysics, the inquiry into the nature of being or reality. While the tenets of his thought have their home in poetry, they are expressed with the force of logic. The Parmenidean logic of being thus sparked a long lineage of inquiry into the nature of being and thinking. Parmenides recorded his thought in the form of a poem. In it, there are two paths that mortals can take, the path of truth and the path of error. The first path is the path of being or what is. The right way of thinking is to think of what is, and the wrong way is to think both what is and what is not. The latter is wrong, simply because non-being is not. In other words, there is no non-being, so properly speaking it cannot be thought. There is nothing there to think. We can think only what is, and, presumably since thinking is a type of being, thinking and being are the same. It is only our long entrenched habits of sensation that mislead us into thinking down the wrong path of non-being. The world and its appearance of change thrusts itself upon our senses, and we erroneously believe that what we see, hear, touch, taste and smell is the truth. But if non-being is not, then change is impossible, for when anything changes, it moves from non-being to being. For example, for a being to grow tall, it must have at some point not been tall. Since non-being is not and cannot therefore be thought, we are deluded into believing that this sort of change actually happens. Similarly, what is one. If there were a plurality, there would be non-being. That is, this would not be that. Parmenides thus argues that we must trust in reason alone. In the Parmenidean tradition, we have Zeno. As Daniel Graham says, while Parmenides argues for monism, Zeno argues against pluralism. Zeno seems to have composed a text wherein he claims to show the absurdity in accepting that there is a plurality of beings, and he also shows that motion is impossible. Zeno shows that if we attempt to count a plurality, we end up with an absurdity. If there were a plurality, then it would be neither more nor less than the number that it would have to be. Thus, there would be a finite number of things. On the other hand, if there were a plurality, then the number would be infinite, because there is always something else between existing things, and something else between those, and something else between those, ad infinitum. Thus, if there were a plurality of things, then that plurality would be both infinite and finite in number, which is absurd.
Subscribe, like, and hit the notification button.